Shalom and greetings, friends. Have you ever been considered a Judaizer? Or have you ever called anyone else a Juda-izer? Or do you consider me a Juda-izer after listening to some of my messages? Well, if you say yes to any of these questions that I introduced to you, then this message is for you. So please listen, please don't get offended, no matter what your background is, no matter where you come from, whether you're Orthodox, Jew, Rabbi, Christian, Messianic, whatever your background is, we as humans like to compartmentalize, as I'll say, or departmentalize or categorize, even Judaize, things into a box. We like to put things into a little square box or just a little box, and they'll say, oh, this is the civil law, and this is the righteous law, this is the law, the oral law. And so we have all these compartments. We like to say, well, this is for the Jewish people only. There's a law for the Jews, and then there's different requirements for Gentiles for salvation. And so we hear a lot of theology, even replacement theology. But where do we get these terms? And let's look to the topic of Juda-izers in this message, and let's try to understand it from a scriptural point of view, and let's try to understand it from a historical point of view, because the two can be quite different. And we need to understand the Word, the holy oracles of our Creator, to define what might be correctly labeled as a Judaizer, but not just look to what we've been taught in the past or any oral teaching that you've received from your pastor, your rabbi, the sages, the Protestants, the Catholics, regardless of the background, like I said. Let's get to the truth of the matter. Let's get to the heart of the matter and really understand these things from a correct point of view, from our Creator's point of view. Now, I've done a word search. I tried to find the word Judaizer, and I could not find it in the complete Jewish Bible. I couldn't find it in the King James Bible, the Old King James, New King James. I haven't found Judaizer. And, well, where does it come from? If you found a scripture, share it with me. And let's midrash. You can make comments on this video message on YouTube. I just request that you be respectful. We don't need to do any name calling or put downs or, disrespectful, types of correspondence. Let's midrash and respect one another. If you believe in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament writings in 1 Corinthians 13, love is more important than being right. And having not love meaning you can break the Torah, break the commandments, because we see the commandments are the expression of His love. But we don't need to be name-calling and put down just because people disagree. I mean, look at the Jews. The rabbis, the sages, they disagree, they midrash, but they still love each other. They realize they're brothers. And how much more are we blood brothers, being believers of spiritual blood, I should say, spiritual water being thicker than blood, physical blood. And so we should be able to midrash and feel free to do so. But in the scriptures, where do we find the word Judaizer? Now you can search it in history, and in the 4th century, when Roman Emperor Constantine, he called himself Constantine the Great, like Alexander did, and he decided to accept Christianity. For the first time, a Greek Roman emperor accepts Christianity under the terms of his agenda and the Catholic Church merging with the Roman Empire, the papacy, the Catholic papacy, Pope. And so they said, well, okay, everyone's going to have to switch the Sabbath to Sunday, the worship of the sun god, as all our pagan cultures have done for centuries. And anyone who's keeping that seventh-day Shabbat is a Juda-izer. And so thou shalt not Judaize the Sabbath. The Juda-izers will continue to be put to death. Anyone who's following these Jewish things will be put to death. But those who embrace the Roman Empire and embrace, the Catholic created doctrines and changes of the Scriptures will stop murdering them and martyring them. And so we see a huge shift. We see a huge shift in what we call Christianity from the 4th century onward, and why most people keep Sunday worship today. But Judaizers, what are Judaizers? Are they those who are actually following the commandments of God, or teaching the Torah? The Torah is simply the instructions, the inspired instructions. There are commandments, the mitzvot, as we say in Hebrew also, for the mitzvot, for commandments. We see that if we are Judaizers for teaching the book of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, well, then we would have to label the Messiah. Most of you call him Jesus, but his Hebrew name is Yeshua, meaning salvation. Yahweh is salvation. Yehovah is salvation. And so, was he a Judaizer? And Paul, we'll see the Apostle Shaul, his Hebrew name. Most of you may call him Paul, but he would be a Judaizer based upon what people call Juda-izers today in the Catholic Church. And we're going to see that in the Scriptures. Let's go to the Scriptures. If you'll turn with me to Matthew. If you don't have your Bibles with you, go get them. If you haven't opened up in a long time, there's probably some dust on it. You need to blow it off. But open that Bible regardless, or maybe you've got an online Bible and now everything's electronic, makes it even easier. Go to Matthew, or as we say in Hebrew, Mattiyahu, chapter 5, and verses 19 through 20. And this is the Messiah speaking in the 1st century. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Now, what I propose to you is that Yeshua is talking about the commandments in the Torah, the written Torah, not the oral Torah. The oral Torah is what the rabbis, the scribes, and the Pharisees said was what they were given by Moses from generation to generation, but it was never written down. And so when the Mishnah was written in the 2nd century CE, Christian era, or AD, however you want to word that, the Mishnah and the Talmud is the oral, the explanations that they say were actually passed on from generation to generation. But we're going to see in the Scriptures here that the requirement of even circumcision, how do we understand that from the Torah? How did the apostles teach circumcision under the new covenant from the Torah only? Did they change it? In Christianity, we're taught, well, there's this huge change in the teaching of circumcision. Well, let's go to the Scriptures, and that's what I'm going to show. Paul taught the Bereans, he taught the Jewish people, and so did Peter and the rest of them, how we need to understand that the requirement for salvation, eternal salvation, is not in the written Torah. And so we'll get into that a little bit. But here we see whoever teaches the least of the commandments, whoever doesn't teach them, and will be called least in heaven. But he says, but whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So under the Catholic and Protestant interpretation of a Judaizer, or definition, our Messiah would be a Judaizer here. Now, if you go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. For I say to you, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And so how do we exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? Well, Protestant theology says, well, see, it's apart from the Torah, apart from the written law, that in Christ, in accepting Him and just believing and having faith in Him, you have righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees. But that is another false teaching, because we see in the Scriptures that the scribes and Pharisees who were following just the oral Torah, they prioritized the oral Torah above the written Torah. They were taking the laws of Moses and putting them down here and putting their oral Torah above that. And they were actually even hypocrites. They were not keeping the written Torah. And let's turn to some scriptures to see this. In Matthew chapter 15, let's turn over to chapter 15. And we see here that in verses 3 through 9, it says, But he, here our Messiah, answered and said to them, and this is regarding the washing of hands, the tradition that they had that was in the oral law that they were teaching in the first century, and the Pharisees were putting Messiah down because his disciples were not doing it according to the oral law. Not according to the written law, but the oral law. And so here's our Messiah's answer to that. And he answered and said to them, Why do you transgress? You sin. You know, in 1 John 3:4 we see sin is a transgression of the law, the Torah. Why do you sin or transgress the commandments of our Creator? Here he says in verse 3, because of your tradition. So here we see traditions being put above the actual written commandments in the Torah. For our Creator commanded, saying, Honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. And that's a commandment in the Torah. But you say, according to the oral law, whoever says to his father and mother, whatever profits you might have received from me has been dedicated to the temple. So in other words, we don't have to keep the fifth commandment because we are taking care of the temple. The temple is more important than the fifth commandment of those 10 that the Creator wrote with his own finger on Mount Sinai. And so they were putting that above it, taking care of the temple. Is released from honoring his father and mother. So here in verse 6, you're released from honoring your mother and father if you're taking care of the temple. The church is more important. The physical church, the temple, the building, the materialism of it all. Thus, you have made the commandment of the Creator by no effect by your tradition. Again, these are Jewish traditions that were taken in regard to their interpretations of the Torah, and not that they're all wrong or bad, but when they are contradictory to the Torah, they are what he's saying here, hypocrites. Well did Isaiah the prophet speak of you, saying, These people draw near with me with their mouth, they honor me with their lips in worship, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching, here we got it, verse 9, teaching as the commandments, as doctrines, the commandments of men. Notice that, commandments of men, not commandments of our Creator here. And so, a Judaizer, if you want to categorize that, would be someone who is keeping the commandments that the Jews have created, but they're not really in the Torah. They are not in the instructions that we see in Moshe or the prophets. And so it's very important that we understand this, that our Creator and Messiah Yeshua, he taught the commandments of God, not the commandments of men, as the higher priority here. Also in Matthew, let's turn to Matthew chapter 23. And let's read verses 2 through 4 here. It says, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. And this is the time he was speaking this in the flesh. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, and if you get the Shem Tov version of Matthew, you see the original writing of Matthew, and you can also, Nehemiah Gordon has a message on the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, and he shows how, what this scripture is referring to is that whatever the scribes and Pharisees teach you according to Moshe, or Moses, observe and do. He's not talking about the oral law here, he's talking about the written law, not the oral law, because he was just putting down the oral law in the previous scriptures. And Matthew's not contradicting himself here, in quoting Messiah. Messiah wasn't contradicting himself. He's talking about the oral law. Whatever they teach, you should do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, they'll even quote Moshe, but they do not do. Even that woman that was caught in adultery, where was the man? Where was the parent rabbi that set her up, or whoever it was that set her up? They weren't doing it. And Yeshua, when he wrote on the ground and he pointed out, he says, he who is innocent cast the first stone. They all left because they were all guilty. So we see that even the Jewish people, the leading rabbis in general, were not really keeping the written Torah to the extent that our Creator expects. They were putting the written law. So we can't. So when he says in the earlier scriptures here that our righteousness must exceed the Pharisees and the scribes, meaning we need to actually keep it, and we need to repent from breaking any commandments and walk the walk and live the righteous way. In verse, getting back to Matthew 23, for they say and do not do. They're not doers of the word. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their own fingers. In other words, they are adding commandments to the Torah, really strict commandments to make it difficult to keep Shabbat. They were saying, well, you can't heal, you can't pray, and if you pray and someone's healed, as Messiah did, well, then you're breaking the Shabbat. And Yeshua said, well, hey, ox falls in the ditch, you take him out of the ditch. You're not following these strict, heavy burdens. So the oral law adds a lot of strict, heavy burdens to the Torah. And so a Juda-izer would be someone who is following these strict, heavy burdens, all these laws that are added. They're not specifically in the Torah, and they are also, if you're breaking the Torah and you're putting these traditions and commandments of men above that, well, then you might be considered a Judaizer. But we don't find it here in the scriptures, as I said. We only find the Protestants and the Catholics and those who are influenced or coming out of those backgrounds. They will say, well, you're following these commandments that are just for the Jewish people only. Well, we don't find that in the scriptures. In fact, what we find in the scriptures is that the sacrificial system, Yeshua fulfilled that. We read the book of Hebrews, and we follow the scriptures the best we can. But what did the Apostle Paul, did he come along and say that these commandments of our Creator, what did he teach about this in the topic we're talking about today? Let's turn to Colossians chapter 2. And I got it quoted here. In Colossians chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, the Apostle Shaul says here, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, all which concern things which perish, with the using according to the commandments of men. not the commandments of our Creator. He's not talking about the written Torah here. He's talking about the commandments of men, the oral law. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion. Beware of religion. Mankind likes to come up with religion and adding commandments to the Torah and forcing them on the people or trying to push them on the people in wrong ways. It's a false humility. They'll use humility and act humble, maybe have those crocodile tears or act humble. And he says, and they neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. So that's what the Apostle Shaul says here. And we can also turn to Titus chapter 1, verse 14. He says, not giving heed. Let's not give heed to Jewish fables or commandments of men. Here we got it, not commandments of our Creator, commandments of men who turn from the truth. So the truth being the Torah, the instructions. Paul was always pointing to the Torah. Well, then people say, well, Acts 15, Paul got in big trouble because he was teaching against circumcision. It wasn't the teaching against circumcision which is the issue of Acts chapter 15. It's the teaching of circumcision according to the oral law that you cannot be saved. Eternal salvation is based upon physical circumcision. And so that was like step number one. If you wanted to be saved, you have to be physically circumcised. Now, where do you find that in the Torah, the written law? Now, we see it in the Abrahamic covenant. And later I'll show how Paul says that Abraham was considered righteous before he was circumcised. He was offered salvation. He was saved before he was circumcised. And that's the point, is that, okay, later on Abraham was circumcised. But circumcision was not any requirement, because after our physical life, he wants our character, he wants our mind, he wants our heart. And that's what he's looking to. It's not, the Jewish oral law had prioritized physical circumcision so highly that you could break the other commandments. As long as you're physically circumcised, you're saved. You have salvation. So let's turn to Acts chapter 15 and let's look at this a little bit more closely, perhaps in a way you've never heard before. And if you have, it's a good reminder. And perhaps I'll have a little nugget in here that you haven't heard before, even if you do believe as I do. Acts chapter 15 and verse 1. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moshe, okay, there are commandments in the Torah, you cannot be saved. And here's the topic, eternal salvation. Now, what I propose to you is that the eternal salvation part was what they were adding to the Torah. And that was like an early requirement for salvation. Now, verse 2, it says, therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension, it wasn't just some small disagreement, and disputed with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem, to the apostles and elders about this question. So was Paul teaching something new here? Paul knew the Torah probably more than any of them. He was trained by Gamaliel, one of the leading rabbis of that time, very respected rabbis. It was like the master of doctorate's degrees in the Torah. He knew it. He knew it so well. Was he teaching something new? Or was he actually teaching circumcision according to the Torah, even for the Gentiles? And that's what I'm going to propose to you. If you'll continue with me here, please don't get offended, but with an open mind and an open heart, search the scriptures like the Bereans to see if what I am saying is true. Okay? I challenge you in a respectful, loving way. Continuing here in verse 2. Or verse 3. So being sent their way by the congregation, or the body, they were sent to Jerusalem. When they had come, they received them and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all the things that the Creator had done through them, Paul and Barnabas. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up, saying, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moshe." Now, what I'm proposing to you here is referring to the whole law of Moshe, which isn't just the written Torah, it is the oral Torah also. This is the issue in Acts chapter 15. And the Christians like to continue on here and say, well, you know, there's only 4 things that the Gentiles are told to keep. They're not told to keep the Shabbat in Acts chapter 15, so it doesn't matter about the Shabbats and the holy days. That was all Jewish things. Those are Juda-izers who keep those things. Well, you look in those 4 things, you know, it doesn't say anything about murdering people. It doesn't say anything about taking His name in vain and other commandments. So does it mean we can just go around and murder people? Because it doesn't say there. If you're a Gentile, can you just go around and start murdering people? Be a serial killer? Because it doesn't say in Acts chapter 15 to the Gentiles that they need to keep that 6th commandment and also the 5th commandment. Now you no longer have to honor your mother and father, because it's not mentioned in Acts chapter 15. Of course, it's not talking about the whole written law. With Acts chapter 15, the only logical explanation that's compliant with the whole book here is that the Gentiles were having problems converting to the faith and keeping the Torah. So what was on the table at the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15 was issues that the Gentiles were having problems with. They were saying, ooh, physical circumcision is difficult. Do I really have to be physically circumcised? Do we have to, what about, they love to drink blood. It was in their culture to drink blood. And now even today we have blood soup. We have blood this, blood that, especially if you're from Asian cultures and certain cultures today. And so whatever the Gentiles were complaining about, these are the issues that were brought to, not the whole written, not all 10 commandments were brought to the table. And we have to understand that, to understand that the Pharisees that had converted and accepted Messiah were saying that they have to be circumcised for salvation. And that was part of the oral Torah. And that was part, and then what Paul was teaching, let's look at what Paul taught according to the Torah to help the converts realize that it's not a requirement for eternal salvation. Beginning in Deuteronomy, or Devarim chapter 10, in verse 16, it says, "Therefore, circumcise the foreskin of your heart, and be stiff-necked no longer." So here we see spiritual circumcision of the heart. And that's part of the new covenant as well. Now, before I continue on, as another proof that Paul wasn't teaching against the Torah, even circumcision was not taught against the Torah. I actually skipped a verse here. If we go to Acts chapter 24, Saul was dragged into court by the Pharisees, and as a heretic, as a ringleader to this cult of what people call Christianity. What the roots of it are Judaism, and Paul was breaking off from that to teach the Messiah. And so they were bringing him to court, trying to put him to death, using the Roman court system to give him the death penalty. And so Paul says here in Acts chapter 24, do you believe the Scriptures? If you do, read Acts chapter 24, verse 14. This is the Apostle Saul says, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, or a cult, so I worship the Creator of our fathers," the Hebrews, "believing all things that are written in the Torah." The written Torah, not the oral Torah, but all things that are written in the Torah and the prophets. Here Paul is saying he is teaching even circumcision based upon the Torah and the prophets. So let's go, I read